Hi guys, I wanted to make sure we were clear on the virtual lime water experiment because we had a lot of different answers about different things, and I'm going to use Matthew's his assignment as an example. Most of what he did was done pretty well. So the first thing up at the top, we had been watching this video where we saw some um, some sucrose, some sugar being burned. And was the sucrose still there? Yes. A lot of you talked about this smoke that was coming up or the change in color. I think somebody noted a different smell, but the biggest thing was the phase change, um, which showed that there was a chemical reaction. And this part was really just an introduction to get us thinking, but that was overall done pretty well. Then we actually got into our lime water experiment. Lime water, the calcium hydroxide is CaOH2. And so when you use these little atom tiles to represent that, I've got one calcium atom, which is shown in purple. Uh, I've got an oxygen and a hydrogen, but there's two of each of those. Okay, that little two means I'm doubling everything inside the parentheses. So this is shown pretty well for lime water. Some of you had things that were or some that were a little off, but ultimately that is what a particle of calcium hydroxide, lime water, should look like. Okay, so then we took that lime water, watched that virtual experiment, and showed you the setup of what that was going to look like. Excuse me, the chemical reaction occurred in that experiment. The starting substances were called the reactants. So what were the things that we had as our starting substances, and then what was produced? What were the products that came of it? Okay, and that's really what these next two were asking you. This is probably the closest that anybody got to answering this correctly. What's the representation of the particles that you think reacted? Well, there were two things that reacted in the experiment. Okay, if I take a look at that video again, what we first started with was just the lime water itself. And the second thing that we added was breath. Well, what's the byproduct of breath? What's mainly there? Well, it's carbon dioxide. So the two things that we should have represented there were the lime water. Let me head back here. We should have had a particle of lime water, and we should have had a particle of carbon dioxide. Okay, so he's got water here, and I think this is the lime water. So you were almost there. Um, what was given off when those two things came together, the carbon dioxide and the lime water? We didn't have carbon dioxide and lime water anymore. What happened was the atoms came together and created something new. So this one wasn't quite right for the product either. Really, what we should have had is what I showed you down here. This section, the calcium hydroxide, so the lime water, which is all this, number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the carbon dioxide, the OCO, okay, those were the reactants. Those were the things that were combining together. Um, so that's really what you should have had up in this first box to say, well, what were the particles that were reacting? In the second box, we should have had this stuff. Okay, what was the product that happened because of it? You no longer had lime water and carbon dioxide, but you saw just regular water, H2O, and that white substance, which if you followed the hint, you'll find out that was chalk. That was calcium carbonate. And if you look at all of this, what that means we started with, if we just had one particle um, of calcium hydroxide, the lime water, it would have had these 5 atoms: hydrogen, oxygen, calcium, oxygen, hydrogen. And if we would have had just one particle of carbon dioxide, it would have had oxygen, carbon, oxygen. Altogether, that's 8. Well, those same 8 atoms are still there as the products after this chemical reaction occurred, but they're rearranged, right? They're no longer calcium hydroxide and carbon dioxide, but now they're just water and chalk. Okay? And that's really what I was hoping you got to down here. And I think Matthew did a nice job explaining this. The calcium hydroxide and the carbon dioxide, which are reactants, the two things that were coming together, they had a chemical reaction, making them form new elements. Didn't change the number of atoms, but the atoms rearranged, right? And they became water, H2O, and they became the calcium carbonate, which is the chalk. So The driving question in all this, what happens at the particle level during a chemical reaction? I think you answered this pretty well too. Uh, the atoms of different compounds change arrangement. They don't just disappear. I think somebody else said, well, they cancel each other out. No, they don't. They rearrange with other atoms, and that creates new compounds.